Hello, everybody. It's Scott again, back with another episode of the Sengoku series. I know it's been a while since I last did a video. Unfortunately, I've been really busy and a little under the weather. I had to grade like 100 term papers for the class that I'm a teaching assistant for. My daughter just transitioned daycare this week, and on top of all that, I had a cold. But I wanted to do a video before I left town for the holidays, and I decided to pick a topic that I felt I could do a really kind of brief video on, which is the ninja or shinobi. Um, it's I would say this is probably this topic or a subject that's probably the most misunderstood in Western culture. I'd like to think that most people in the West who encounter stuff about ninja, like, they used magic, that they disappeared in puffs of smoke, that they could climb walls, that they had special, intricate weapons for every occasion, that they all wore identical uniforms of, all black from head to toe. I would hope that most people look at that and they think, well, yeah, that's ninja, but it has no basis in reality. That's just ludicrous. But, you don't know. So if you really do believe that, ninja had special powers, that they had special ninja weapons they carried on them like Batman, and their endless, bottomless utility belts and so on, no. Not true. Forget what you've read in comic books and cartoons and or even movies. Um, it's just not true. Um, even the term ninja is more of a modern invention. Um, Came much later in Japanese culture than did not exist in the medieval Japanese period. Um, I think it's just easier for Western ears than the term shinobi, which is much more, I guess, accurate for that time period. Shinobu is a verb that means to conceal or to hide. Uh, and Shinobi no mono means a person who is particularly good at concealing himself or herself and hiding. There's also a term, kunoichi, which is used in reference to women, female ninja. Um, but that's actually not, again, a correct term. It wouldn't have been used in medieval Japan. It comes from a certain way of reading the characters for woman in Japanese. So it's a play on words that came much later. Um, so basically, there was no such thing as, these villages made up entirely of ninja clans. There weren't these isolated um, villages where there was a head ninja and he passed on all the secrets and training um, to his students or the other members of his extended family. Um, and there is some basis in that, in the sense that there were these very isolated, far from the main trade routes, villages that did end up exercising a great deal of autonomy during the medieval period in Japan. Because as I've talked before, in these videos, with the Onin War and the breakdown of central authority in Japan, there really was no way to sort of keep the peace and just to go on living day-to-day life, tending to the fields, selling your goods, whether you're a merchant, an artisan, a butcher, a farmer, whatever. If you're constantly worried about bandits swooping in and no one, there's no lord to protect you because the lord is tending to business elsewhere, or the lord just doesn't have the resources anymore to send anyone to save your village, you've got to do it for yourself. And if you've ever seen the famous, Kurosawa movie, Seven Samurai, it's kind of the same idea. These peasants being raided by, brigands, bands of bandits, basically, and they've got to protect themselves. Now, in the movie, they go out and they hire, samurai who are without masters, ronin, to defend them. But for many villages in the Sengoku period, they didn't have that option. They couldn't really afford to do that, so they had to do it themselves. And they did have local samurai, what are called samurai of the soil, ji samurai. And these would be sort of the very minor members of the warrior class. They're sort of in that little gray area between the peasants and the samurai, the warrior class. The commoners, I should say, not necessarily peasants, but commoners and the warrior class. And in between, you have, who are technically samurai. They're descended from samurai. They could probably produce a record saying, I am descended from so-and-so who was, made a member of the warrior class centuries or decades ago. But they're not living, prestigious, glorious lives. They have, some land in the countryside that they tend to, they maybe have a certain amount of status and relatively high resources compared to the commoners that they live around. And because of their place in the social hierarchy, they're afforded a great deal of respect. But in relationship to other samurai, especially the nobility, the actual aristocracy living in and around the capital, Kyoto, they're practically almost peasants themselves. But anyway, they live out in the countryside in these remote areas with these villages that are constantly under attack from bandits. And because they're samurai and because they're descended from samurai, they probably have some understanding of warfare, basic understanding. Again, they're not Clausewitz, they're not reading necessarily Sun Tzu's Art of War. But they know, certain things that if you're small in number, if you have some, normally peaceful peasants, commoners whose really only knowledge is tending fields and so on, the best you can really hope for is to conduct guerrilla warfare. Pick some very strategic locations, which, if you're in mountainous terrain, is relatively easy to find. You can find ravines or choke points where bandits or whatever attacking force would have to make themselves vulnerable, and then you ambush them, you attack them, you run away, and then you ambush them again, you lure them into traps and so forth. So that's really what happened in a lot of these places, and there's two particular areas of Japan famous for this sort of development of autonomous villages who practiced guerrilla warfare, and those provinces are Iga and Koga. Now, Iga was an actual province, sort of in south-central Japan, not far from Kyoto, the capital at the time. But again, far off from the main trade routes, not a place that was sort of, a mecca of activity, commercial or political or otherwise. And Koga was actually a part of a larger province, Omi province, which again is relatively, in the middle of Japan, main island of Japan, not far from the capital. But again, mountainous and relatively remote from the main hustle and bustle of medieval Japan. So in both these places, you had the development of these villages practicing guerrilla warfare, and they basically existed as independent entities defending themselves. And you hear a lot about in the Sengoku period, sort of the low overtaking the high. The idea that these people who were normally on the lower end of the social ladder, coming into their own and going into business for themselves. And that's basically what happened in Iga and Koga. These villages could no longer rely on a feudal relationship with a lord. The lords just weren't doing it for them anymore. The lords had really had their power destroyed, or at least a lot of them in the Onin War. So they have to do, they have to defend themselves. And it wasn't, it's important to stress that there wasn't really an ideology, there wasn't some sort of emancipatory liberation ideology behind, let's defend ourselves. It was purely out of survival. The fact that, we can't rely on anyone else, there's no external sovereign that can really come in and save us. We have to act out of our own self-interest, self-preservation. And this went on from about, the start of the 16th century until the 1570s, when Oda Nobunaga, the great sort of first of the main three unifiers of Japan during this period, was really on the ascendancy. He was based out of South Central Japan, the main island of Japan. So it was inevitable that he would have to deal with, these sort of guerrilla independent villages in Iga and Koga, and he did, and very brutally. And it was because these, rather remote provinces were able to put up such spirited resistance because they had been doing it for such a long time. They had been fighting, bandits and other encroaching warlords for such a long period of time that when Oda Nobunaga sent his, subordinates to pacify these regions and bring them under his control, the Iga and Koga, ninja, as they became known, were very stalwart in resisting him, and ultimately they failed. Obviously they couldn't really stand in opposition forever to this incredibly powerful force that was Oda Nobunaga and his successor Toyotomi Hideyoshi. But there came from this a legend, and that was the legend of sort of the Iga and the Koga ninja, and it was one that they really marketed for themselves. They kind of went back to just being villagers and commoners and sort of low-ranking samurai after that. But quite understandably, a little later on, when you had the Tokugawa clan take over and finish unifying Japan, these ninja went to work for the Tokugawa shogunate, the military dictatorship run by or headed by the Tokugawa clan. And they were basically acted as professional spies. They hadn't been professional ninja spies, whatever, beforehand, but because they had gained this reputation, because they had become so famous for using guerrilla tactics and espionage to protect themselves out of necessity, they were able to sort of monetize that, or I guess market that, as skills to be a sort of special forces, commando, intelligence unit for the Tokugawa shogunate into the 17th and 18th, and I'm not sure if they went all the way into the 19th century. It's probably not, but there certainly were still espionage, what pop culture would call ninjas today. And I should go into more detail about what I mean by ninja exactly, and ninja tactics or whatever. And basically, as I've said before in my very first video, when I was talking about myths about the Sengoku period, being a ninja was a job, and it wasn't a class. It didn't require you to be born into a certain social group in order to be a ninja. Like I said, there were low-ranking samurai, and there were commoners who were doing this. So it cut across sort of class lines. And the idea that it was somehow dishonorable to be a ninja, it certainly probably wasn't smiled upon, the idea of sneaking around or using, guerrilla tactics. That's not, it's not heroic in the traditional sense. Heroic is charging into overwhelming odds and defying the odds, or dying a tragic but noble death. Stabbing someone in the back or having them assassinated while they sleep is not as glorious, but it's effective, and it's certainly, if you're a commoner and there's no way you can win in a straight fight, with a warlord's army, you're not going to embrace dying a tragic but noble death if, doing the sneaky thing will allow you and your family to continue living. You can keep, eating food, making love to your wife, seeing your kids grow up. You're going to go for the underhanded ambush rather than the foolhardy, certain charge into death. If that's, those are your options. And so, it was basically everything from guerrilla warfare, ambushes, raids, arson, burning storehouses, camps, and so forth. But it also included, spying, what we think of as, doing reconnaissance in a hidden way, sort of. If you've seen the movie, another Kurosawa movie, Kagemusha, the Oda and the Tokugawa send spies to check on whether or not Takeda Shingen is really dead or not. And there's those three guys who are, watching from the hilltops in the forests to see if it's really Takeda Shingen or an imposter. Those guys are basically ninja. They're not dressed up like, in elaborate disguises or wearing all black, which, why would they be wearing all black during the day anyway? But, but because they're spying, because they're doing that sort of hidden covert reconnaissance, they would be considered, ninja. Sabotage, doing surprise attacks. The list kind of just goes on and on. Assassination. We know that Oda Nobunaga was the victim of an assassination attempt. Didn't succeed. He was just wounded, but he was shot by a sniper. There's an untrue sort of story, which again I think mostly comes from Kagemusha, which is that Takeda Shingen was killed by a sniper. That's not true. It was an embellishment that came later to sort of glorify the Tokugawa, who, as I said, ended up becoming the supreme rulers of Japan after the medieval Sengoku period. And it was sort of a way to sort of boost their own legend by saying, we really killed Takeda Shingen. Shingen actually died of an illness. Uesugi Kenshin, another famous warlord from this period, also, supposedly died of illness. Allegedly, that's sort of the mainstream view. There is a belief that he was killed by a ninja while he was using the toilet. The idea of a ninja hiding in a latrine and killing this famous guy or girl. There are rumors that Kenshin was a woman, but I'll talk about that when I do a Kenshin video or series of videos. We'll see. But anyway, whether or not any of that's true, again, ninja were sort of just a lot of popular stories being told about them. And it wasn't until much later that you really had the idea of ninja schools or special training to be a ninja. More accurately, anyone who was doing guerrilla warfare or espionage or spying would have been automatically considered a ninja. It wasn't until much later when actually the people of, or certain families in Iga and Koga went into business for themselves again and said, we have all these special tactics, we have all these special weapons, we have these schools of being a ninja. None of it was true. It was all made up, and basically to sucker gullible people who wanted to buy into the ninja legend, to sign up and say, teach me how to be, a ninja. And if you know anything about Japanese culture and the schools of swordsmanship, in dojos and so forth, there was this precedent for, if you want to learn this certain type of swordsmanship, you can join a school and a teacher will show you how to do it, and it's martial arts training and so forth. So the Iga and Koga families were basically, again, just marketing on this legend, and, basically acting on this brand to sort of sucker people in. But and they wrote all these texts which they said proved that ninja as a martial art, whatever, goes back centuries and centuries and centuries. And occasionally you'll hear about this document talks about how to be a shinobi, or to conceal oneself, and it's from way back in ancient times. Came over from China. So actually, ninja as a concept is a Chinese thing. No, I mean, espionage has been around since ancient times. Spying has been around in ancient times. There are records of the ancient Romans, ancient Greeks, pretty much every ancient civilization automatically, saw the value of spying, of sabotage, of espionage, of guerrilla warfare, ambushes. But to put a name on it like ninja or shinobi, and say that it's this special ninja art is wrong. There is no real unique ninja art. If you were a spy, if you were an assassin, if you were a guerrilla warrior in Sengoku, Japan, or any other time, you will be considered a ninja or shinobi. So if you learn nothing else from this video, I really want to stress this. There is no special group. There is no special school of ninja. Ninja, shinobi, it's synonymous with espionage, guerrilla warfare, and so on. Now, two of the famous ninja from this period, who if you've played video games or read comic books set in Sengoku, Japan, medieval Japan, you have Hattori Hanzo, who was a samurai in service to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who went on to become the third and final unifier of Japan, who set up the Tokugawa shogunate. And Hattori Hanzo came from Iga province. He was, he's considered to have been a ninja. So this kind of, which should tell you, if you're one of the people who believe that ninja and samurai were enemies, or even just dichotomous groups, that's not true. They were, samurai could be ninja, commoners could be ninja. If you were doing espionage or guerrilla warfare, you were a ninja, regardless of what social group you belonged to. Hattori Hanzo was a samurai, so we know that he came from Iga province. It's reasonable to assume that he was one of these guys who, because of the state of things in early medieval Japan, had become familiar with ambush tactics, guerrilla warfare, learning the lay of the land in order to use the terrain to your advantage. And that's why he was considered a ninja. He, because of his background in that area, because he came from a background of, these villagers using ambush tactics and espionage, he was able to bring that to the Tokugawa clan and use that knowledge in service to his lord. Was he actually, climbing walls and, all that stuff, dressed in all black? No. He was, I'm sure he acted like any other samurai, dressed the same as any other samurai during that time. We know he was famous for using a spear in combat. He had a nickname for being particularly ferocious in combat, so he wasn't just hiding in the shadows and being a secret agent or anything. He was, fighting and living and acting just like any other samurai. It just so happened that because he had this knowledge and background, being a guerrilla warrior in the mountains of Iga province, that he's also considered a ninja. Another famous ninja from this period is Fuma Kataro, who served the Hojo clan, which was a very powerful clan in eastern Japan, the main island of Japan. And his story is that he's much more of a commoner person, and there's a lot of uncertainty whether or not there was, who was Fuma Kataro, because it seemed to have been a name that was shared by a lot of guys. who led this group of basically bandits, people who lived out in the countryside, in the wilds, so to speak, who were very adept at ambushing, at raids, at using arson. Um, a lot of sort of the imagery that's connected with Fuma Kataro is of a wild man, of a demon, someone who thrives on chaos and anarchy, and those are all things that we could assume one would associate with a bandit, someone striking from the shadows, who's wild, who's not really associated with civilized samurai behavior. Which again just goes to show, how incorrect it is to think of ninja as some sort of monolithic absolute group. Hattori Hanzo, samurai, ninja. Fuma Kataro, wild bandit man, demon guy, also ninja. And really, it's if you're going to talk about sort of comparisons to Western culture and Western history. In a way, they're a bit like militias or irregular soldiers or paramilitary forces or bushwhackers, if you're familiar with the U.S. Civil War. When you read about the Fuma clan or the followers of Fuma Kataro, it almost sounds a lot like Quantrill's raiders in Kansas and Missouri. Acting on, they would basically, just massacre villages and do raids on, not village, small towns, and all in the name of the Confederacy. But in actuality, they were informal. They were just sort of a private militia whose interests happened to coincide with the Confederacy. And there was, still some acknowledgement and association there. They weren't completely independent. But you kind of have to think that it's a bit similar to what was going on with Fuma Kataro and his followers. They had already been, living out in the wilds and doing these things in their own interests. The Hojo clan comes along, and they figure, why not go work for these guys? We'll help serve the interests of the Hojo. And they'll acknowledge us and benefit us. I'm sure, Fuma Kataro, got something in return for helping further the interests of the Hojo clan. With Hattori Hanzo, I'm sure it was very much, I'm serving my lord. I'm bringing my knowledge and skills to him to better serve him. Which was in Hattori Hanzo's interests materially as well as, according to the moral code of the day. Again, it's not something that's very complicated. It's very misrepresented and misunderstood, and people like to think of ninjas as this fun thing. I mean, ninjas versus pirates is kind of like, it's just something that you think of when you think of something fun about, medieval Japan or even just Japanese culture in general. Even if I showed you a picture of a ninja without saying what it was, just a guy dressed up in all black and stuff, you recognize it. But again, it has no basis in actual reality or history. And unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot written on this fact. Most of what I'm talking about today in regards to the Iga and the Koga comes from this book. It's actually just a chapter in War and State Building, Medieval Japan, by Pierre Soiri. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's called Autonomy and War in the 16th Century Iga Region and the Birth of the Ninja Phenomenon, which is a very academic title. And there's a lot of it's unfortunately not as much about the ninja phenomenon as it is about sort of the history of the Iga and the Koga regions and sort of how the progress of the Sengoku period in relation to them. It's only really the last couple of pages where he talks about sort of how the ninja phenomenon grew out of, these informal guerrilla militias in Iga and Koga. But it's definitely worth checking out, at least, it's in terms of English resources for actually the truth about the ninja. But yeah, that's it. I really want to get started on the Oda Nobunaga videos. I'm probably going to do 3 where I sort of cover his career, or life, I should say, really. Starting from him going from this really unknown figure in South Central Japan to taking over his little corner and becoming sort of a major figure in Central Japan, to actually taking the capital and it becoming sort of starting this process where it becomes really clear that he's on the path to unification and becoming the man who really unifies and brings all of Japan back under his control, to his sudden death and assassination in 1582. And there's a lot there to cover. I'm reading Lammer's book, Japonicus Tyrannicus, which is a really unfortunate title for probably easily the best book that's out there about the life of Oda Nobunaga. It's mostly political, which is really more my interest. I'm not so much of a military guy. But anyway, probably after Thanksgiving, hopefully before Christmas. Hopefully it won't be that long before another video. But have a good day. I'll see you guys later. Bye.